ancient Rome built the largest empire the Western world had ever seen. It conquered Britain, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. It endured for over 1,000 years. And yet, when Rome's greatest thinkers wanted to understand justice, beauty, courage, or the nature of the soul, they did not look to their own city. They looked to Athens. A city-state so small it could fit inside a single county. A city that rose, blazed, and collapsed in the span of roughly 2 centuries, yet somehow planted ideas so deep that every democracy, every university, every theater, and every courtroom in the Western world still grows from its roots. Athens did not last. Athens did not conquer the known world. Athens did something far more remarkable. It thought the thoughts that no one had ever thought before, and it thought them so clearly that 2,500 years have not been enough to shake them loose. How did one rocky, fractious, brilliantly chaotic city-state manage to invent the West? Join us as we trace the entire arc of Athenian history, from the Mycenaean warlords who first fortified its great rock, to the devastating final moment when the last flicker of Athenian independence was snuffed out by Macedonian conquest. Before there was democracy, before there was philosophy, before there was theater or science or any of the ideas we call Western civilization, there was a rock. Rising nearly 300 feet above the surrounding plain, the limestone outcrop that would become the Acropolis dominated the landscape of Attica like a natural watchtower. From its flat summit, a sentinel could see enemies approaching from every direction. The sea glittered to the southwest. The mountains of Hymettus and Pentelicus framed the horizon to the east. The Saronic Gulf opened toward the wider Mediterranean world beyond. This was not simply a convenient hill. It was, in almost every meaningful sense, the reason Athens existed at all. The region of Attica, roughly the size of the American state of Rhode Island, sits at the southern tip of mainland Greece. It is a land of hard contrasts. Jagged mountain ranges cut the territory into isolated pockets of habitable valley. The soil, thin and rocky, surrenders its harvests reluctantly. Summer heat bakes the limestone white. Rainfall arrives stingy and unpredictable. Anyone who has walked the Attic countryside in July understands immediately why the ancient Greeks developed such a complicated relationship with the gods. They needed all the help they could get. And yet this harsh landscape concealed extraordinary gifts. The olive tree, which demands exactly the kind of poor, well-drained soil that Attica provides in abundance, would become the foundation of Athenian agricultural wealth. Olive oil-lit lamps preserved food, cleansed bodies, and served as one of the ancient world's most tradable commodities. The mountains of Pentelicus yielded marble of startling quality, the brilliant white stone that would eventually define the aesthetic of an entire civilization. And deep beneath the southern hills at Laurion lay something perhaps more immediately valuable than either: silver. Vast, glittering deposits of silver ore that, at the right historical moment, would fund the fleet that saved Greece from Persian conquest. But the most consequential geographic feature of Attica was not on the land at all. It was the coastline. Attica's irregular shores created sheltered harbors, and the greatest of these lay about 5 miles southwest of the Acropolis Rock, at a deep natural bay called Piraeus. 3 separate harbors nestled within its protective headlands. The sea was not merely visible from Athens. It was, in every practical sense, the city's front door. This orientation toward the water would shape Athenian character in ways that no political decision ever could. poor soil cannot feed a growing population. But the sea can. Trade can. Ships can reach every corner of the Mediterranean world and return laden with grain, with luxury goods, with ideas. Geography, as the Athenians were not the first and would not be the last to discover, is destiny. The rock above the plain was waiting. The people who would transform it were about to arrive. By around 1600 BCE, the rock above the plain had found its people. The Mycenaeans, a warrior civilization of breathtaking ambition, recognized immediately what that limestone outcrop offered. They built accordingly. The Acropolis became a palace citadel, home to a wanax, a king administrator who controlled the surrounding territory through a sophisticated bureaucracy of scribes, tax collectors, and military commanders. Linear B tablets, the earliest writing found in Europe, recorded grain allocations and bronze rations with meticulous precision. This was not a primitive chieftain's camp. It was a functioning palace economy, connected by trade routes to Egypt, to Cyprus, to the distant shores of Anatolia. What made Athens distinctive even then was its defenses. Mycenaean builders constructed walls of such monstrous scale that later Greeks, unable to imagine human hands lifting such stones, attributed the work to the Cyclopes. These cyclopean walls, some blocks weighing several tons, encased the Acropolis summit in a fortification that felt quite literally like the work of giants. And tucked into the north slope, the builders did something remarkably shrewd. They cut a secret staircase down through the living rock to reach a natural spring. Fresh water in a siege was the difference between survival and surrender. The Athenians, even in the Bronze Age, were thinking ahead. Then, around 1200 BCE, the world ended. What destroyed Mycenaean civilization remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries. Historians call it the Bronze Age collapse, and it was catastrophic on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. Within the space of roughly 50 years, nearly every palace civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean simply ceased to exist. Mycenae fell. Tiryns fell. Pylos burned so completely that archaeologists can still read the frantic linear B tablet scribes were writing as the flames approached. The Hittite Empire, which had contested Egypt as an equal, vanished. Entire trade networks collapsed. Writing itself disappeared from Greece for 4 centuries. Athens, remarkably, claims it did not fall. The archaeological evidence is frustratingly thin, but Athenians later insisted with fierce pride that their city alone among the great Mycenaean centers survived the catastrophe without destruction. Whether this was precisely true or a useful founding myth, something clearly persisted on the Acropolis. And that thread of continuity mattered enormously, because the collapse triggered migrations across the Aegean world. Refugees and displaced peoples flooded eastward, settling the coast of Anatolia in a movement Athens later took credit for leading. These Ionian colonies would one day become the birthplace of Greek philosophy. The centuries that followed were dark indeed. Population collapsed. Trade vanished. Villages contracted to near subsistence. The great palace complexes that had defined the Bronze Age crumbled slowly into ruin. But the rock remained, and on it, the memory of something greater than what currently existed. That memory, however dim, would prove to be the seed of everything that came next. Out of the darkness, something new was taking shape. Not a kingdom restored, not a palace rebuilt, but something stranger, and, in time, far more consequential. By around 1100 BCE, the old Mycenaean order had dissolved entirely. The one-axe, the palace king, was gone. What emerged in his place was a system built not on royal bloodlines but on aristocratic ones. Athens would be governed by its great families, clans who called themselves the Eupatridae, meaning quite simply the well-born. In their own estimation, good breeding was qualification enough to rule. The transition happened gradually. For a time, Athens retained kings, but their power was steadily stripped away, function by function. First, a polemarch was appointed to handle military command. Then a second official, the archon, took over civil administration. Eventually, the kingship itself became just another appointed office stripped of its sacred permanence. By around 750 BCE, the position was no longer held for life. By 683 BCE, 9 archons governed simultaneously, elected annually, rotating power among the noble families who alone were eligible to hold it. Power, in other words, had been distributed, but only among those who already possessed it. The Eupatridae controlled everything that mattered. They owned the land, which meant they controlled the food supply. They monopolized the priesthoods, which meant they controlled access to the gods. And crucially, they held law entirely in their heads. Justice in early Athens was unwritten, interpreted case by case by aristocratic judges who answered to no written standard and no independent authority. A poor farmer wronged by a wealthy neighbor had little recourse beyond the goodwill of men whose class loyalties ran deep. This was the Athens taking shape during what historians call the rise of the polis, the city-state. The agora, the open space at the foot of the Acropolis, began functioning as a gathering place for civic life. Tribal assemblies met, religious festivals organized collective identity, and the earliest institutions of shared governance took root. Athens was becoming something more than a village, more than a fortress. It was becoming a community with shared rules, shared spaces, shared ambitions. But shared did not mean equal. The agrarian crisis building through the 7th century exposed Athens' deepest fault line. Poorer farmers, working small plots on thin soil, fell into debt during bad harvests. The terms they accepted were ruinous. Some borrowed against their own bodies, and the failure to repay meant enslavement. By the early 600s, debt slavery was common enough that ordinary Athenians lived in genuine terror of losing not just their land but their freedom. The Eupatridae, meanwhile, grew richer as smaller farms collapsed into their estates. Into this tension walked Draco in 621 BCE. His mission was straightforward: write the laws down. For the first time in Athenian history, justice would not live in the memory of aristocratic judges. It would exist on wooden tablets, visible to all. The result was revolutionary in form and brutal in content. Draco's code reportedly prescribed death for offenses as minor as stealing a cabbage. The Athenian orator Demades would later say the laws were written not in ink but in blood. The word draconian has carried that judgment ever since. Yet, even Draco's savage code represented a kind of progress. Written law, however harsh, was at least consistent. It could be read, debated, and eventually challenged. The question was whether challenging it was even possible. Athens had laws now, but the men who administered those laws remained the same men who had always held power. Something more fundamental would have to break before genuine change could arrive. That breaking point was coming, and his name was Solon. The year was 594 BCE, and Athens was close to tearing itself apart. On one side stood the Eupatridae, the old noble families clutching their estates and their privileges. On the other stood the hectomoroi tenant farmers who surrendered 1/6 of every harvest to their landlords, and beneath them the enslaved debtors, Athenians who had lost everything, including their freedom, to men of their own city. The gap between these worlds had grown so wide that violent revolution seemed not merely possible but inevitable. Both sides, remarkably, agreed on one man who might hold things together. Solon was a merchant and a poet, well-born enough for the aristocrats to trust and plain-spoken enough for the poor to believe. In 594 BCE, he was appointed archon with extraordinary powers, essentially a mediator given a free hand to remake Athenian law from the ground up. It was an extraordinary act of collective desperation, and it would change history. His first move was the one that stunned everyone. Solon announced what he called the sisartia, a Greek word meaning the shaking off of burdens. In a single decree, he canceled all outstanding agricultural debts. The mortgage stones, physical markers planted in indebted land to record what was owed, were pulled from the earth across Attica. Solon himself would later write that he had freed the black soil, which had carried those stones in shame. For thousands of families, it meant survival. He went further. Debt slavery was abolished entirely. No Athenian citizen could ever again be enslaved for failure to pay what was owed. Those already sold into bondage abroad were, where possible, bought back and returned home. It was an act without precedent in the Greek world, and it drew immediate fury from the wealthy, who had expected a reformer, not a revolution. Yet Solon refused to satisfy the other extreme. The poor had hoped for a full redistribution of land, the great estates broken up and handed over. Solon refused. He was building something more durable than vengeance. He was building law. His political reforms divided all Athenian citizens into 4 classes based not on birth but on agricultural income. The wealthiest, the Pentacosium, those whose land produced 500 measures of grain per year, held the highest offices. Below them sat the Hippias, the knights, and the Zeugidei, the middle farmers. At the bottom stood the Thetes, the landless poor, who had previously counted for nothing in Athenian governance. What Solon gave the Thetes was not full equality, but something almost as radical. They could attend and vote in the ecclesia, the citizens' assembly. They could serve on a new popular court called the Heliaia, where ordinary Athenians would judge cases that had previously belonged to aristocratic magistrates alone. For the first time, the poorest citizens had a legal voice. Power had not been handed to them, but the door had been opened. Solon also created a new council of 400, drawn from all classes above the Thetes, to prepare business for the assembly. It was a counterweight to the ancient Areopagus, the council of former archons that had long served as the aristocracy's private chamber of power. When his reforms were complete, Solon did something almost unbelievable. He left. Knowing that both sides would pressure him to undo what he had done, he voluntarily exiled himself for 10 years, traveling to Egypt and Cyprus and the courts of foreign kings. Athens, he reportedly said, would have to find its own way now. The instability that followed proved him right to worry. Without Solon's personal authority holding things together, old factions reformed and new ones emerged. Regional rivalries among Attica's plains, hills, and coastal communities produced deadlocked elections and, in some years, no archon at all. The reforms endured, but the peace they were meant to create remained fragile, contested, always one bad harvest or one ambitious nobleman from collapse. Athens had been pulled back from the edge of civil war. It had been given laws, classes, courts, and the ghost of something that might one day become genuine self-government. But the city was. Athens had been given laws. What it had not been given was stability. Into that fragile vacuum stepped a man who would become the most consequential figure in Athenian history before democracy itself. Pisistratos was a general of genuine reputation, a cousin of Solon by some accounts, charming enough to disarm enemies and shrewd enough to understand that power, in 6th century Athens, belonged to whoever seized it first. He seized it 3 times. In 561 BCE, he arrived in the agora with self-inflicted wounds, claiming his enemies had tried to assassinate him. The assembly, moved by sympathy or taken in by spectacle, granted him a personal bodyguard. With those men at his back, he occupied the Acropolis and declared himself tyrant. The word carried no automatic condemnation in the ancient world. A tyrannos was simply a ruler who had taken power outside traditional channels. Whether that was good or bad depended entirely on what he did with it. Pisistratos was expelled twice, first through a coalition of rival noble families in 556 BCE, and again after a second return. He came back a final time in 546 BCE with mercenary soldiers, Thessalian cavalry, and enough money from silver mines in Macedonia to make his position permanent. This time, he stayed. What followed surprised nearly everyone. Pisistratos did not govern through terror. He governed through generosity and spectacle. He redistributed land confiscated from exiled opponents and gave it to poor farmers. He sent traveling judges into the countryside so that rural Athenians no longer had to make the long journey to the city for legal hearings. He offered loans to small farmers struggling to buy tools and seed. The Solonian constitution remained formally intact. Elections continued. Pisistratos simply made sure his allies won them. But his most lasting achievement was cultural. Pisistratos understood something that pure politicians rarely grasp. A city becomes a community through shared stories and shared celebrations. He reorganized the Panathenaea, the festival honoring Athena, into the Great Panathenaea, celebrated every 4 years with athletic competitions, musical contests, and a magnificent procession up to the Acropolis. He instituted or greatly expanded the city Dionysia, the theatrical festival in honor of Dionysus where Athenian playwrights would eventually compete for prizes. Those contests would one day produce Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes. The stage of Western drama was being built, quite literally, under a tyrant's patronage. Perhaps most significantly, Pisistratos commissioned the first standardized written text of the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Before this, the poems existed in countless regional variations, recited differently across the Greek world. By fixing the text and requiring Homeric recitation at the Panathenaic festival in a specific ordered sequence, he bound Athenian identity to a shared cultural inheritance. Every citizen who attended heard the same words, the same heroes, the same vision of what it meant to be Greek. He also began transforming the physical city, commissioning temples and fountains that announced Athens as a place of consequence and ambition. Pisistratos died peacefully in 527 BCE, an almost unheard of end for a Greek tyrant. His sons Hippias and Hipparchus inherited power jointly, continuing their father's cultural patronage through the early years of their rule. For a time, the dynasty seemed as permanent as the marble they had set into the Acropolis. But inherited power is a fragile thing, and what Pisistratos had held together through personal authority and genuine popular support would prove far harder for his sons to maintain. A private act of revenge, a blade in a public procession, would set in motion the events that finally broke the tyranny's hold on Athens and opened the door to something the world had never seen before. The blade fell on a festival day. In 514 BCE, during the Panathenaic procession, two young Athenians named Harmodius and Aristogeiton pushed through the crowd and cut down Hipparchus. The murder was not political philosophy in action. It was personal. Hipparchus had pursued Harmodius romantically, been rebuffed, and responded with a calculated public humiliation of Harmodius' sister. What began as wounded pride ended in assassination. Hippias survived. And the man who survived was not the relatively relaxed ruler his father had been. Fear does something to power. Hippias became the tyrant the family had never quite been before, executing suspected opponents, tightening his grip on the city, surrounding himself with guards. The conspirators had achieved the opposite of their intention. Athens did not feel freer. It felt watched. Yet something had shifted in the minds of ordinary Athenians. The tyrannicides, as Harmodius and Aristogeiton were immediately called, were elevated into heroes, then into something approaching saints. Bronze statues would eventually be erected in their honor in the Agora, the first time in Athenian history that non-divine mortals received such recognition. The story was rewritten, cleaned of its personal grievances, transformed into a founding myth of resistance. A city preparing to govern itself needed its martyrs. The actual end of the tyranny arrived not from within Athens but from outside. Sparta, guided by an oracle from Delphi and lobbied by the exiled aristocratic family of the Alcmaeonids, sent an army northward in 510 BCE. Faced with Spartan hoplites and collapsing support, Hippias negotiated his own departure. He walked out of Athens and eventually found refuge with the Persians, a fact that would carry enormous consequences in the decades to come. With Hippias gone, the old contest between noble factions immediately resumed. Two figures rose, Isagoras, backed by the traditional aristocracy and by Sparta, and Cleisthenes of the Alcmaeonid family, who had spent years in exile and returned with something rare, a genuinely new idea. When Isagoras outmaneuvered him in the initial power struggle, Cleisthenes did something no aristocrat had done before. He appealed directly to the people. The response changed history. What Cleisthenes proposed and implemented between 508 and 501 BCE was nothing less than the reconstruction of Athenian society from the ground up. The old four Ionian tribes based on kinship and therefore controlled by powerful families were abolished. In their place came 10 entirely new tribes, each named after an Athenian hero, each deliberately constructed to include citizens from the coastal regions, the city itself, and the inland plains. No tribe would be geographically concentrated. No aristocratic family could dominate one. the basic unit of this new system was the deme, the local village or neighborhood. Every male citizen was registered in his deme, and that registration became his permanent political identity. A man was no longer primarily the son of his father's clan. He was a citizen of his deme, a member of his tribe, a participant in the whole. From these 10 tribes flowed the new Council of 500, with 50 representatives drawn from each tribe by lot. This body prepared the agenda for the full citizen assembly and handled the day-to-day administration of the city. Power was no longer the inheritance of birth. It was, at least in principle, available to any citizen willing to serve. The guiding principle underneath all of it had a name: isonomia. Equality before the law. Not equality of wealth or status, but equality of standing in the eyes of the city's institutions. One final mechanism completed the design. Ostracism allowed the assembly, once a year, to vote a citizen into temporary exile without trial or accusation of crime. Any individual who seemed to be accumulating dangerous amounts of power could simply be sent away for 10 years. It was democracy protecting itself from the very tyranny it had just escaped. What Cleisthenes had built was imperfect and incomplete. Women, slaves, and foreigners remained entirely outside it. But for the roughly 30,000 male citizens it embraced, something. To the east of the Aegean Sea, something vast had been building for decades. The Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the middle of the 6th century BCE, had grown at a speed that staggered the ancient world. Lydia fell. Babylon fell. Egypt fell. By the time Darius I consolidated his rule in 522 BCE, Persia controlled territory stretching from the Indus River to the edges of Europe, the largest empire the world had yet seen. It was held together by roads, royal governors called satraps, and the ever-present threat of overwhelming military force. On the western edge of this empire lived the Ionian Greeks, city-states along the coast of modern-day Turkey. They spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, and wrote in Greek letters, but they paid tribute to Persia and answered to Persian-appointed rulers. For a generation, this arrangement had held. Then, in 499 BCE, it shattered. The Ionian Revolt began in Miletus, sparked by a failed Persian military expedition and the political calculations of a tyrant named Aristagoras. He traveled west seeking help, first to Sparta, which refused, then to Athens. What was Athens thinking when it agreed to send 20 ships? Perhaps democracy, still new and raw, felt a kinship with Greek-speaking people chafing under foreign rule. Perhaps the decision was simply impulsive, made by an assembly whose confidence had not yet been tempered by experience. Whatever the reasoning, those 20 ships would set the course of the next 2 decades. The Ionians and their allies, joined by Athens, marched inland and burned Sardis, the wealthy capital of the satrapy of Lydia. The lower city, including a temple, went up in flames. The sight of Persian power humiliated on its own soil was electrifying. The consequences would be severe. The revolt itself collapsed. Without sustained unity among the Greek city-states and outmatched by Persian resources, the Ionians were systematically subdued. In 494 BCE, a combined Persian fleet destroyed the Ionian ships at the Battle of Lod. Miletus, the city where the revolt had begun, was captured and its population scattered. The Ionian Revolt was over. Darius, ruling from Persepolis and Susa, absorbed this information coolly. He had known rebellions before. What genuinely interested him, according to ancient tradition, was the identity of those 20 ships from the Greek mainland. Who were these Athenians? A servant was ordered to say the name aloud to him 3 times each day at dinner, a reminder that a debt remained unpaid. Whether the story is literally true matters less than what it reveals. Persia was not finished with Greece. The burning of Sardis had given Darius both a justification and a motivation that went beyond mere imperial expansion. This was personal in the way that only humiliation can make things personal for the powerful. Between 492 and 491 BCE, Persian forces moved methodically westward. Thrace and Macedonia were brought under Persian authority. Heralds were dispatched across the Aegean, arriving in Greek city after city demanding earth and water, the traditional symbols of submission. Many cities complied. The islands of the Aegean, one after another, bent the knee. The heralds arrived in Athens too, and in Sparta. Both cities refused, each in its own emphatic way. Athens had helped set this storm in motion with 20 ships and an act of solidarity, or perhaps recklessness, that now threatened to consume the city itself. The democracy that Cleisthenes had built was barely a decade old. It was about to face its first existential test on a plain northeast of the city, within sight of the sea. The Persian fleet appeared off the coast of Attica in September of 490 BCE. 600 ships by Herodotus's count, carrying perhaps 25,000 soldiers under the command of 2 generals, Datis and Artaphernes. They chose their landing site carefully. The plain of Marathon, roughly 26 miles northeast of Athens, offered level ground for cavalry and a sheltered bay for ships. It was, militarily speaking, a perfect choice. The Athenians had perhaps 10,000 hoplites to answer this threat, joined by roughly 1,000 soldiers from the small city of Plataea, the only ally who came. They marched to Marathon and stopped at the edge of the plain, watching the Persian force assemble below. What followed was 5 days of waiting. A standoff that revealed how genuinely terrifying the situation felt from inside the Greek camp. The 10 Athenian generals were divided. Some argued for remaining defensive, trusting the narrow terrain to neutralize the Persian cavalry advantage. Others urged immediate attack. The man who broke the deadlock was Miltiades, a general with actual experience fighting Persians who understood their tactics and believed, perhaps above all others, that boldness was the only answer. He made his case to Callimachus, the war archon whose vote would tip the decision. Callimachus voted for battle. The stratagem Miltiades devised was elegant and dangerous. Knowing that Persian strength lay in the center of their line, he deliberately thinned his own center and reinforced his flanks. The result would look, at first, like a disaster. On the morning of the battle, the Athenian hoplites did something no Greek army had done before. They ran. The distance across the open plain toward the Persian line was roughly a mile, perhaps somewhat less in the final charge, but the image burned itself into the Greek imagination forever. Men in bronze armor, carrying heavy shields and spears, running toward the largest military empire on earth. The Persians, watching this advance, assumed the Athenians had lost their minds. What happened next was swift and decisive. The Persian center pushed forward and broke through the thinned Greek middle exactly as planned. But on both flanks, the Athenians crushed the Persian wings, then wheeled inward, folding around the Persian center from both sides at once. The double envelopment transformed a seeming rout into a slaughter. The Persians fled toward their ships. Some were driven into a marsh. The killing continued at the water's edge. When the counting was done, the numbers were almost incomprehensible. 6,400 Persians lay dead on the plain. The Athenians lost 192 men. But Marathon was not finished. The Persian fleet, still largely intact, had loaded its remaining forces and was sailing south around the Attic Peninsula toward Athens itself. The city stood nearly undefended. The same army that had just fought needed to get there first. They marched through the night. By the time the Persian fleet arrived and its commanders looked toward shore, the Athenian army was already there, waiting on the beach. There was nothing to be done. The fleet turned away. Athens was safe. A man named Pheidippides, or Philippides in some accounts, had already run a different route, the one that echoes down to our own time. Sent to Sparta before the battle to request help, he reportedly covered 150 miles in roughly 2 days, an extraordinary feat of endurance. The story attached to him later, the dying messenger gasping a single word of victory before collapsing, may be legend more than history. But it carried something true about the day's meaning. The 192 Athenians who died at Marathon were buried on the plain itself, in a tomb called the Soros that still stands today. That decision was unprecedented. The Athenian dead were almost never buried away from home. This was different. This place was sacred now. Marathon transformed Athens' sense of itself completely. A democracy had faced an empire alone and won. The question was no longer whether the democratic experiment could survive. The question, thrilling and dangerous in equal measure, was what Athens might become next. The silver came as a gift, though Athens nearly squandered it. In 483 BCE, workers in the mining district of Laurion, deep in the southern reaches of Attica, broke through into something extraordinary. A rich new vein of silver ore, far richer than anything previously found in the region. The windfall was enormous, enough that the Athenian assembly faced a genuine question: what to do with money that no one had expected to have? The traditional answer was the simple one: distribute it. Give every Athenian citizen his share, perhaps 10 drachmas each, a modest sum but welcome. Most politicians were inclined to do exactly that. It was popular. It was easy. It was, argued one man, a catastrophic mistake. Themistocles was not a man of ancient lineage or aristocratic elegance. He had risen through the democratic machinery of Athens on the strength of something rarer than breeding: genuine strategic vision. He had watched the Persian fleet sail away from Marathon and understood with unusual clarity that it would return. The question was not if, but when, and in what strength. His proposal before the assembly was bold enough to seem reckless. Rather than distributing the silver, Athens should use it to build a fleet. Not a modest fleet. 200 triremes, the long, sleek warships that were the most advanced naval technology of the age. The construction of Piraeus as a proper fortified harbor followed as part of the same vision, transforming a natural bay southwest of the city into a naval base that would anchor Athenian power for generations. Standing against him was Aristides, a man whose reputation for personal honesty had earned him the title the Just. Where Themistocles was flexible and cunning, Aristides represented a certain Athenian ideal of straightforward virtue. He saw Athens as a land power and believed it should remain one. The rivalry between the two men was not merely political but philosophical, a genuine argument about what kind of city Athens was meant to be. The assembly resolved the dispute through ostracism. In 482 BCE, Aristides was voted into exile for 10 years, his pottery shards cast against him by citizens who, as the famous story has it, included one illiterate farmer who asked Aristides himself to write the name Aristides on his shard, explaining only that he was tired of hearing the man called Just. Aristides, by the account, obliged him. With his rival gone, Themistocles moved quickly. The triremes took shape in the dockyards of Piraeus, each one a narrow, lethal machine requiring 170 rowers to drive it through the water at devastating speed. Here was something the aristocratic world had not anticipated. The rowers were not soldiers in bronze armor. They were the thetes, the poorest class of Athenian citizens, men who owned too little land to equip themselves as hoplites. Now they were the city's essential warriors. Now their votes carried weight that wealth alone could not dismiss. The fleet was not merely a military decision. It was a social revolution conducted in timber and bronze, reshaping who mattered inside the democracy. By 481 BCE, the triremes were ready, and they were needed. News from the east confirmed what Themistocles had known in his bones since Marathon. Xerxes, son of Darius, had spent years assembling the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever seen. Greece had perhaps months left to prepare. The question of whether Athens had prepared wisely, whether 200 ships could stand against an empire, would find its terrible answer in the waters of a narrow strait not far from the city itself. In the spring of 480 BCE, Xerxes moved. The numbers recorded by Herodotus strain belief, and historians have long argued over them, but the scale of the invasion, even discounted, was unlike anything Greece had ever faced. The Persian king commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers drawn from across the empire, Medes, Lydians, Ethiopians, Indians, and dozens of other peoples, a walking catalog of the ancient world. To carry them into Europe, Persian engineers accomplished something that bordered on the mythological. They bridged the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe, by lashing hundreds of ships together side by side and laying a road of timber and earth across their decks. When a storm destroyed the first attempt, Xerxes reportedly ordered the waters themselves whipped and fettered as punishment, then built the bridges again. The army walked across on water. The sheer theater of it was intentional. This was a king announcing to the watching world what Persian power could do. The Greeks, never quite unified, scrambled to organize a defense. A coalition formed around Sparta, whose land forces remained the finest in the Greek world. The plan was to hold Persia at a series of narrow points where numbers would matter less. The first of these was a mountain pass in central Greece called Thermopylae, a bottleneck between cliffs and sea where a small force might hold against any army. For 3 days, they did. A force of roughly 7,000 Greeks, led by the Spartan king Leonidas, held the pass against assault after assault. The Persian infantry, however brave, could not bring their numbers to bear in the narrow ground. Then a local Greek, a man named Ephialtes, betrayed the defenders. He guided a Persian column along a mountain path that emerged behind the Greek position. Leonidas, learning of the flanking move, sent the bulk of the allied forces away. He remained with his 300 Spartans and perhaps a few hundred others. They knew what was coming. The stand that followed on the final morning became one of history's defining images of sacrifice. The 300 died to the last man, buying time for Greece to pull back, to breathe, to think. Their epitaph, composed by the poet Simonides, was carved into a stone marker at the pass. "Go, tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." The road into Greece was now open. In Athens, Themistocles had already anticipated this moment. A document known as the Themistocles Decree, ordering the evacuation of the city, organized the departure with remarkable efficiency. Women, children, and the elderly were sent to Troezen, Aegina, and Salamis. The men who could row would row. Athens did not surrender. It simply emptied itself. When the Persian army arrived, they found a city nearly abandoned. A handful of defenders, those who had interpreted an older oracle's mention of a wooden wall as meaning the Acropolis itself rather than the fleet, made a final stand behind wooden barricades on the sacred rock. The Persians broke through and burned it. The temples where Athenians had prayed, the shrines that stood at the center of civic and religious identity, came down in smoke and ash. To the watching refugees on Salamis, the fires on the Acropolis would have been visible across the water. The city was gone. And yet the fleet was whole. Themistocles now had to execute the second and more difficult part of his gamble. With the allied Greek commanders debating retreat, he maneuvered, cajoled, and finally deceived to force a battle in the narrow straits of Salamis. He sent a secret message to Xerxes claiming the Greeks were about to flee, inviting the Persian fleet to close off the straits overnight. Xerxes, watching from a golden throne set on a hillside above the water, took the bait. At dawn in late September, the Persian fleet entered the straits and found the Greeks waiting. The narrow water negated Persian numbers entirely. Greek triremes, faster and better coordinated in confined space, struck from multiple angles. The Persian fleet folded on itself, ships ramming their own allies. The smoke over Athens had barely cleared when the Greeks finished the job. In the summer of 479 BCE, a combined Greek army met the Persian land forces one final time on the plains of Plataea in the region of Boeotia. Under the command of the Spartan regent Pausanias, the Greeks fielded the largest hoplite army the alliance had ever assembled. The Persian commander Mardonius, who had wintered his forces in Greece after Salamis, chose to give battle. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The fighting was brutal and at moments nearly went wrong for the Greeks, but when Mardonius fell in the thick of combat, Persian resistance collapsed entirely. His forces fled north. The invasion was over. Greece had survived the impossible. But survival, as Athens quickly understood, was not the same as security. Persia still controlled the eastern Aegean coastline. Greek cities in Ionia remained under Persian authority. The threat had been beaten back, not destroyed. Someone would have to finish the work. Athens, with the largest and most battle-tested fleet in the Greek world, had a very clear sense of who that should be. In 478 BCE, representatives from across the Aegean gathered on the sacred island of Delos. What they created there was called the Delian League, a maritime alliance bound by a common oath and a common purpose: to liberate Greek cities still under Persian control and to prevent Persia from ever threatening Greece again. Each member would contribute to a shared treasury, housed in the sanctuary of Apollo on Delos itself. Smaller or more distant cities could contribute silver rather than ships, a practical arrangement that seemed reasonable at the time. Athens would serve as hegemon, the leader, the one who held the military command and managed the treasury. No one in those early years seemed to think too carefully about what that arrangement would eventually mean. The man who drove the league's early campaigns was Cimon, son of Miltiades, the general who had won Marathon. Cimon was everything Athens admired in those years: aristocratic, handsome, generous with his personal wealth, and ferociously effective as a commander. Through the 470s BCE, he led the league's fleet across the Aegean, clearing Persian garrisons from key positions along the Thracian coast and driving Persian influence steadily eastward. The crowning achievement came around 466 BCE at the Battle of the Eurymedon River on the southern coast of Anatolia. In a single day, Cimon destroyed both the Persian fleet and a substantial land army. It was, by any measure, a stunning demonstration of what the League had become. Yet even as the victories mounted, something was shifting beneath the surface. When the island of Naxos attempted to leave the League in the 460s BCE, Athens sent the fleet to compel their return. This was not liberation. This was empire using the vocabulary of alliance. The treasury at Delos was filling not just with contributions, but with the payments of cities that had traded Persian masters for Athenian ones and were beginning to notice the difference. Tribute flowed to Delos. Athenian warships patrolled the sea lanes. Athenian officials increasingly managed disputes between member states. The question being asked in allied council chambers quietly at first was one that would grow louder with every passing decade. Had they joined a league of equals, or had they simply enrolled in an Athenian empire? The answer would only become clearer as Athens grew more confident and more bold. The question answered itself in 454 BCE with a single administrative decision that stripped away every remaining pretense. The treasury of the Delian League, that common fund housed for decades in Apollo's sanctuary on Delos, was packed onto ships and transported to Athens. The official justification was security. A disastrous Athenian military expedition to Egypt had recently been destroyed by Persian forces, and the treasury needed protecting. Perhaps there was even some truth in that reasoning. But no one in the allied cities missed the symbolism. The money was now in Athens, under Athenian control, in the heart of the Athenian Acropolis. The League's shared fund had become the Athenian state treasury. The distinction between ally and subject was, from that moment forward, largely theoretical. Pericles, who had emerged as Athens' most dominant political figure through the 450s BCE, saw no contradiction worth dwelling on. He had a city to build, literally. Beginning around 447 BCE, League funds began flowing directly into the most ambitious construction program the Greek world had ever seen: the Parthenon, the Propylaea. Temple after temple rising in white marble above the city that now commanded an empire. When Allied representatives protested that tribute paid for liberation was being spent on Athenian monuments, Pericles answered with breathtaking directness. Athens provided the defense. Athens bore the risk. Athens could spend the surplus as it saw fit. The Allies were not entirely wrong to feel the ground shifting beneath them. It was not just the treasury. Athens imposed its own weights, measures, and silver coinage across the empire's territories, a standardization that simplified Athenian commerce while quietly erasing the economic independence of member states. Athenian courts gained jurisdiction over serious cases involving allies. Athenian colonists called klerouks were planted on the land of restless subject cities, equal parts reward for Athenian citizens and warning to anyone contemplating resistance. Thasos had already learned what resistance meant. The wealthy island, rich in gold mines and timber, had tried to withdraw from the League in 465 BCE. Cimon besieged it for nearly 3 years before it surrendered, its walls demolished, its fleet confiscated, its tribute increased. Naxos had learned the same lesson earlier. The pattern was consistent. Any member state that tested Athenian authority discovered that the warships came, and that they did not leave until the matter was settled entirely on Athenian terms. Here was the paradox that would haunt Athens through the rest of its golden age. At home, Athenian democracy was deepening and expanding. Pericles pushed reforms that opened political participation to the poorest citizens, paid jurors so that ordinary men could afford to serve, and celebrated the city as the school of Greece, a place where freedom and public life were inseparable values. The funeral oration he would deliver years later over the Athenian war dead remains one of history's most stirring defenses of democratic principle. And yet the democracy was funded by empire. The freedom Athenians celebrated rested on the subjugation of others. The same fleet that had saved Greece at Salamis now patrolled the Aegean to keep restive tributaries in line. The Athenians knew it, debated it, and largely concluded that greatness required certain uncomfortable arrangements. It was a tension that could not hold forever. The subject cities remembered their grievances. Sparta watched the growth of Athenian power with mounting alarm. And across the Greek world, the question was no longer whether Athens had built an empire. The question was how long that empire could survive its own contradictions. No figure in Athenian history embodied the city's contradictions more completely than Pericles himself. Born into wealth and aristocratic connections, he spent his career championing the common citizen. Commanding an empire built on tribute, he spoke in the language of freedom. For roughly 30 years, from his consolidation of power around 461 BCE until the eve of catastrophe, he was Athens, and Athens was him. His reforms remade civic life from the ground up. Most consequentially, he introduced pay for jury service, a small daily wage that transformed democratic participation from a theoretical right into a practical reality. For the first time, a poor Athenian craftsman or farmer could afford to spend the day in court without starving his family. Thousands took up the invitation. The assembly, the courts, the committees of governance, all filled with voices from every corner of the social spectrum. Democracy stopped being an institution and became a habit. Yet Pericles also drew a harder line around who could belong. In 451 BCE, he pushed through a citizenship law requiring that both parents be Athenian-born. The effect was immediate and lasting. Children of mixed unions lost their political standing. The circle of belonging tightened precisely as the mechanisms of participation expanded. It was a paradox typical of the man, generous in one direction, exclusionary in another. The building program that began in earnest around 447 BCE announced Athenian ambitions in stone. Pericles appointed the sculptor Phidias to oversee the transformation of the Acropolis, and what followed was one of the most concentrated explosions of artistic achievement in human history. The Parthenon rose on the hill's southern edge, its columns of Pentelic marble achieving a refinement so precise that the architects introduced subtle curves to prevent the optical illusion of sagging. Inside stood a chryselephantine statue of Athena 40 feet tall, ivory skin and gold drapery gleaming in the filtered light. The propylaea, the monumental gateway, followed. The Odeon, a roofed concert hall for musical competitions, went up beside it. Athens was remaking itself in its own image of perfection. The money came, as critics noted loudly, partly from allied tribute. The debates in the assembly were fierce. But Pericles held firm. The city deserved monuments equal to its power. Around this man gathered the most extraordinary circle of minds in the ancient world. Anaxagoras the philosopher, Herodotus the historian, Sophocles the tragedian, all moved through Periclean Athens, shaping and being shaped by the atmosphere of restless inquiry. At the center of his private life stood Aspasia of Miletus, a woman of formidable intelligence who kept a salon that attracted the great thinkers of the age. She could not vote, could not hold office, occupied a legally ambiguous position as a foreign-born woman. She influenced policy conversations that shaped an empire. It was Pericles who gave the city's self-image its most enduring formulation. In the funeral oration he delivered over Athens' first war dead in the great conflict with Sparta, he described his city as the school of Hellas, a place where open debate, aesthetic beauty, and civic courage were not competing values but a single way of life. The speech survives because Thucydides preserved it, and it still reads like a city boasting aloud about its own soul. But beneath the marble and the rhetoric, the pressures that had been building since the treasury crossed from Delos to Athens continued to mount. Sparta had watched the Periclean decades with growing unease. The subject cities chafed. The empire that funded the school of Hellas was also the engine of resentment spreading across the Greek world, and the reckoning that awaited Athens would arrive with terrible speed. What does it mean for a single city in a single century to permanently alter how human beings think, feel, and make sense of their world? Walk through Athens in the 500s BCE, and you would find the answer carved in marble, spoken in verse, and argued aloud in the open air of the agora. The Parthenon, completed in 438 BCE under the hands of the architects Ictinus and Callicrates, was no simple temple. Every column tilts almost imperceptibly inward. The floor curves upward at the center. The spacing between columns varies by fractions that the naked eye cannot detect, but the mind somehow registers as perfect. Phidias and his workshop covered the exterior frieze with nearly 500 feet of continuous sculpture depicting the Panathenaic procession, ordinary Athenians marching alongside gods. The building declared something radical, that civic life itself was sacred. Down on the slopes of the Acropolis, the Theater of Dionysus held audiences of perhaps 17,000 citizens for the annual City Dionysia Festival. Attendance was not mere entertainment. It was civic obligation. The city distributed theater tokens to those who could not afford admission. Generals sat in the front rows beside priests. Rich and poor watched together as playwrights competed for the prize of a laurel crown and something far more lasting. Aeschylus, who had fought at Marathon and carried that experience into his art, gave Athens' tragedy with genuine moral weight. His Oresteia trilogy explored justice, vengeance, and the transition from blood feud to civic law. Sophocles followed with a precision that still devastates. His Oedipus the King confronted the terror of self-knowledge, the unbearable discovery of who one actually is. Euripides pushed further still, giving voice to slaves, women, and the defeated, characters the audience expected to ignore and found themselves unable to dismiss. Theater was not escape. It was interrogation. Comedy served the same democratic function with sharper elbows. Aristophanes lampooned generals, politicians, and philosophers alike before crowds who included the very men he mocked. That Pericles or Cleon could be savaged on stage, and the stage was paid for by the state, said something important about the health of Athenian public life. Then there were the historians. Herodotus of Halicarnassus, drawn to Athens by its reputation, gathered the vast oral traditions of the Persian Wars into a coherent narrative and asked why things happened as they did. He invented inquiry. Thucydides, colder and more rigorous, stripped away myth entirely and produced his account of the Peloponnesian War as an analysis of power, human nature, and the terrible logic of conflict. His work reads less like ancient history than like a warning addressed directly to the future. And in the Agora, every morning, a stocky and famously ugly man named Socrates stopped strangers to ask them what they actually believed. He wrote nothing down. He needed no theater, no temple, no stone. The questions were enough. This extraordinary flowering was already beginning to cast shadows. The war with Sparta, grinding and brutal, would test whether a city that had imagined so much could survive what was coming. By the 430s BCE, the shadow Pericles had long anticipated was finally taking shape. Two worlds had grown up side by side on the Greek peninsula, and they could no longer comfortably share it. Athens commanded the sea. Its fleet of perhaps 300 triremes could project force anywhere in the Aegean, and the tribute flowing in from 200 allied city-states fed a treasury that seemed to outside observers almost obscene in its abundance. Sparta commanded the land. Its infantry, the fearsome hoplites of the Peloponnesian League, were the finest soldiers in the known world, men raised from birth for a single purpose. Neither power could easily destroy the other, and that very fact made the tension between them almost unbearable. What finally set events in motion was a quarrel that had nothing directly to do with either city. In 435 BCE, the distant colony of Epidamnus on the Adriatic coast erupted in civil war. The neighboring city of Corcyra, itself a colony of Corinth, refused to help. Corinth intervened instead. Then Corcyra, alarmed and isolated, did something dramatic. It approached Athens and asked for an alliance. The Athenian assembly debated the question carefully. Corcyra possessed the second largest fleet in Greece. To leave it unaligned was a risk. To absorb it into Athens' orbit was a provocation. The assembly voted for a defensive alliance, technically restrained, practically explosive. Corinth, a close Spartan ally, was furious. Then came Potidaea, a colony subject to Athens but with deep cultural ties to Corinth, Potidaea revolted in 432 BCE, backed by Corinthian volunteers. Athens besieged the city. The cost was staggering, both in money and in Spartan patience. Corinth brought its grievances to Sparta. Other allies added their own complaints. The Spartans called a congress and listened as speaker after speaker described Athenian aggression, Athenian arrogance, and the steady encirclement of anyone foolish enough to stand in Athens' way. The Spartan assembly voted that Athens had broken the peace. Ultimatums followed. The debate inside the Athenian assembly was one of the great political moments of the ancient world. Some counseled compromise. Pericles, standing before thousands of his fellow citizens, refused. His logic was cold and clear. Athens could not give way without surrendering the credibility on which its entire empire rested. But Athens also could not win a conventional land war against Spartan infantry. The solution was to change the terms entirely. Pericles proposed something that must have felt almost counterintuitive. Do not fight on land. When the Spartan army marched into Attica, as it would, Athenians should retreat behind the long walls connecting the city to its port at Piraeus. Let the Spartans burn the farms. Athens would survive on seaborne trade and tribute. Its fleet would raid the Peloponnesian coast, bleeding the enemy slowly, denying them the decisive land battle they craved. It was a strategy of endurance. It asked Athenians to watch their fields destroyed from the safety of their walls and trust that time was on their side. In the spring of 431 BCE, a Spartan allied force from Thebes attacked the small city of Plataea, a loyal Athenian friend. The long peace shattered. The Peloponnesian War had begun. Thucydides, who would live through it, called it the greatest upheaval that had ever shaken the Greek world. He was not exaggerating. The conflict would drag on for nearly 3 decades, and before it ended, it would demand from Athens a price no one standing in that assembly had imagined possible. The war Pericles had designed demanded patience. What arrived instead, in the summer of 430 BCE, was catastrophe. A disease originating somewhere in Ethiopia and spreading through Egypt and Libya before reaching the crowded port of Piraeus, entered a city already straining under the weight of refugees. Athenians had flooded inside the long walls from the surrounding countryside, exactly as Pericles had instructed. Packed together in the summer heat, with inadequate sanitation and no room to breathe, they had created perfect conditions for something monstrous. Thucydides caught the plague himself and survived to write about it. His account remains one of the most harrowing documents in Western literature. Victims burned with fever, their throats and tongues turning bloody. Sneezing, coughing, retching followed. The skin broke into ulcers. Many sufferers, maddened by thirst, threw themselves into cisterns. Doctors died at the same rate as their patients, helpless against something they had never encountered. The bodies piled faster than the living could bury them. What disturbed Thucydides almost as deeply as the physical suffering was the moral collapse that followed. Why observe laws and customs? Why defer gratification? Why maintain decency? If death was coming for everyone regardless. The plague killed perhaps 1/4 to 1/3 of Athens' population over roughly 4 years. It killed 10,000 soldiers sent to besiege Potidaea. And in 429 BCE, it killed Pericles. His death left a void that Athens would spend the next 2 decades failing to fill. Into that vacuum stepped Cleon, a leather merchant's son with a voice like a thunderclap and no patience for subtlety. He was brilliant, abrasive, and genuinely effective, but he represented something new in Athenian politics. A man who won crowds not through careful reasoning, but through force of personality and the raw pleasure of watching someone say what others merely thought. Aristocrats like Thucydides, the historian, despised him. The assembly adored him. Cleon's power became terrifyingly visible in the Mytilenean debate of 427 BCE. Mytilene, a major city on the island of Lesbos, had revolted and been crushed. The assembly, inflamed and vengeful, voted to execute all adult male citizens of Mytilene and enslave the women and children. A trireme was dispatched with the orders. Then, overnight, something remarkable happened. Athens changed its mind. A second assembly convened, debated again, and voted to reverse the sentence. A second, faster trireme raced across the Aegean and arrived just in time. An entire city was saved by ours and the Athenian capacity, however imperfect for self-correction. That capacity was not always sufficient. By 416 BCE, with the war grinding through uneasy truces and flaring violence, Athens turned its attention to the small island of Melos. Melos was neutral, populated by Dorian Greeks with sympathies toward Sparta, but no active hostility toward Athens. It simply wished to be left alone. Athens sent envoys. The dialogue that followed, as recorded by Thucydides, is one of the most chilling exchanges in all of ancient literature. The Athenians were direct. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Appeals to justice, to the gods, to the sympathy of Sparta were dismissed one by one. Melos refused to submit. Athens besieged the island, and when it fell, executed all the men and enslaved the women and children. The sentence voted in passion against Mytilene, and then reversed, was now carried out in cold calculation against a people who had done Athens no harm. It was a moment that would echo forward through centuries of political philosophy, a stark question about power, morality, and what a democracy becomes when it stops asking whether something is right and asks only whether it can be done. An even greater test was already forming on the horizon. He was, by almost every account, the most dazzling human being Athens had ever produced. Tall, magnetic, with a slight lisp that somehow made him more charming rather than less. Alcibiades had been raised in the household of Pericles himself after his father died at the Battle of Coronea. He studied under Socrates, who reportedly loved him and despaired of him in equal measure. He won 3 chariot races at Olympia. He crashed dinner parties uninvited and left with everyone's admiration. He was vain, reckless, bisexual by common knowledge, and utterly, catastrophically brilliant. Athens adored him. Athens could not control him. And in 415 BCE, Athens chose to follow him. The idea had been circulating for years. Sicily, the enormous island to the west, was home to Syracuse, a city nearly as powerful as Athens itself. Certain Sicilian allies had been appealing to Athens for help. And now Alcibiades stood before the assembly and transformed a limited intervention into something far grander. A full-scale expedition, conquest of Syracuse, perhaps all of Sicily, perhaps Carthage after that. An empire beyond the empire. His opponent in the debate was Nicias, a careful, pious, cautious general who had negotiated the peace bearing his name just 6 years earlier. Nicias stood before the assembly and argued against the expedition with everything he had. He even tried a desperate reverse gambit, demanding a force so enormous that the cost would shock Athens into restraint. Instead, the assembly simply voted to send the enormous force. Whatever Nicias requested, they would provide. The armada would be the largest Athens had ever assembled. Then came the night that changed everything. On the eve of departure, in the darkness before dawn, someone moved through the streets of Athens and mutilated the Herm Ai, the stone busts of the god Hermes that stood at doorways across the city. Noses, faces, and genitals were smashed. By morning, the city was in religious panic. This was not mere vandalism. This was a terrible omen, possibly a conspiracy against the gods themselves, perhaps against the democracy. The whispers pointed immediately at Alcibiades. He demanded an immediate trial, a chance to clear his name before sailing. His enemies, calculating that conviction would be easier once his fleet supporters had departed, insisted the expedition proceed first. The investigation would await his return. So the armada sailed. 134 triremes, 5,000 hoplites, thousands of sailors and support troops, gleaming in the summer sun off Piraeus. Thucydides called it the most costly and finest-looking expedition that any single Greek city had ever sent out. It had barely reached Sicily when a state trireme arrived with orders. Alcibiades was recalled to stand trial. He obeyed, then slipped away at the first opportunity and sailed directly to Sparta. The greatest expedition in Greek history now continued west without its architect, under the cautious command of the man who had never wanted to go at all. What followed was, for 2 years, a grinding agony. The Athenian fleet arrived off Sicily in the summer of 415 BCE with overwhelming force and squandered it almost immediately. Nicias, cautious by temperament and now ill with the kidney disease that would eventually kill him, hesitated when boldness might have won everything. Syracuse was not yet fortified to the north. A rapid encircling wall could have sealed the city and forced surrender within weeks. Instead, the Athenians built slowly, paused, debated, and gave the Syracusans time to build their own counterwalls, cutting off each Athenian attempt to complete the encirclement. Then came the figure who would seal Athens' fate. In the spring of 414 BCE, a Spartan general named Gylippus arrived in Sicily with a small force and an enormous talent for organization. He was everything Nicias was not: aggressive, inventive, and unbothered by doubt. Almost immediately, he began transforming Syracuse's defense. He broke through Athenian siege lines, restored Syracusan morale, and started receiving reinforcements from across Sicily and beyond. The besiegers were becoming the besieged. Athens sent more ships, more men, more money. Reinforcements arrived under the general Demosthenes, not the famous orator, but a capable and clear-eyed soldier who assessed the situation with brutal honesty. One final assault, he argued. If it failed, Athens should cut its losses and withdraw. The night assault on the plateau of Epipolae in 413 BCE was a catastrophe of darkness and confusion. Athenians killed Athenians in the chaos. The survivors stumbled back to the harbor in disarray. Demosthenes urged immediate retreat. And here Nicias, the most cautious man in the Athenian army, made his most reckless decision. He refused to leave. There would be signs, portents, religious obligations. Then the moon went into eclipse on the 27th of August, 413 BCE. The priests declared it an omen. Nicias ordered the fleet to wait another 27 days. Those 27 days were a death sentence. When the Athenians finally attempted to break out through the great harbor of Syracuse, they found a Syracusan fleet waiting, experienced now, confident, with ships reinforced and chains stretched across the harbor mouth. The battle that followed was the most catastrophic naval defeat in Athenian history. The harbor was too small for Athenian tactics, too crowded for maneuver. Ship rammed ship. Men drowned in their armor. The Syracusans cheered from the shore as the famous fleet of Athens simply ceased to exist. And then came the retreat overland. Nearly 40,000 men, wounded, starving, and terrified, began moving south through hostile countryside. Syracusan cavalry harried every step. At the river's Asinaris, pressed from all sides, men threw themselves into the water to drink and were cut down where they knelt. Nicias surrendered to Gylippus personally. Demosthenes surrendered separately. Both were executed, against Gylippus's wishes, by Syracusan officials who feared what lenient treatment might inspire. The survivors were marched to the stone quarries outside Syracuse, where they were kept in open pits, exposed to the Sicilian sun by day and the cold by night. Thucydides recorded that roughly 40,000 Athenians were killed, captured, or enslaved in those quarries. He called it the greatest action in the war, and for the defeated, the most calamitous. Athens had sent its finest army to the edge of the Western world. None of it was coming home. The city that received this news in 413 BCE was not the Athens of Pericles. It was something shaken to its foundations, and the question now was whether it could survive at all. The news from Sicily broke something in Athens. Not its will, not yet, but its sense of invincibility. And its enemies knew it. Within months of the disaster, allied states across the Aegean began calculating their odds. Chios revolted in 412 BCE, then Miletus, then city after city along the Ionian coast. The empire Athens had built across decades was peeling away like plaster from a damaged wall. Every defection cost tribute, every tribute lost meant fewer ships. Fewer ships meant less ability to prevent the next defection. The spiral was dizzying and obvious to everyone watching. Persia watched with particular interest. For decades, the great power to the east had stayed largely at arm's length from Greek affairs. Now the satrap Tissaphernes saw his opportunity. Persian gold began flowing to Sparta, funding a Peloponnesian fleet in the Aegean, the one theater where Sparta had always been weakest. For the first time in the war, Sparta could project real naval power. Athens faced enemies it could not simply outlast. And then the crisis turned inward. By 411 BCE, a group of wealthy Athenians had convinced themselves that democracy itself was the problem. The assembly was too unpredictable, too easily swayed by demagogues, too costly to maintain in wartime. Persia, they whispered, might deal more generously with an oligarchy. In a climate of fear and exhaustion, this argument found purchase. In the early summer of 411 BCE, through a combination of intimidation and procedural manipulation, an oligarchic council called the 400 seized control of Athens. The democracy that had functioned, however imperfectly, for nearly a century was suspended in a single afternoon. But the 400 made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot about the fleet. At Samos, the Athenian navy, crewed largely by the poorer citizens who rowed the triremes, received news of the coup with fury. These men had no property, no estates, nothing to recommend oligarchy to them. They refused to recognize the new regime, declared themselves the true Athenian democracy in exile, and elected their own generals. The fleet, not the city, would carry the constitution forward. And then they recalled the one man who might actually turn the war around, Alcibiades. His return was improbable by any measure. Condemned for sacrilege, defected to Sparta, then to Persia, trusted by nobody, he was nonetheless a military genius without rival in the Aegean world. The fleet needed him, and he needed rehabilitation. The arrangement was simple and effective. At Abydos in 411 BCE and at Cyzicus in 410 BCE, Alcibiades led the Athenian fleet to stunning victories against the Peloponnesian and Persian forces, destroying enemy ships, capturing supplies, cutting off Spartan access to the straits. The 400, bereft of popular support and unable to deliver the peace they had promised, collapsed within 4 months. Democracy was restored. Athens was battered, its empire fractured, its treasury thin. But it was fighting again and somehow winning. What drove a city so close to ruin to keep reaching for survival would define the final, agonizing chapter of the war. For a brief moment, it seemed Athens might actually survive. The victories Alcibiades had delivered bought time, even optimism. But time, in the end, was the one thing Athens no longer had enough of. In 406 BCE, near the Arginuse Islands off the Ionian coast, the Athenian fleet won its last great battle of the war. Against a Spartan force under the Admiral Callicratidas, the Athenians destroyed over 70 enemy triremes and killed the Spartan commander himself. It should have been a triumph celebrated for generations. Instead, it became a catastrophe of a different kind. A storm had risen after the battle. Dozens of disabled Athenian ships were left floundering, their crews drowning in the water. The generals in command, faced with deteriorating weather and pressing military concerns, failed to organize a proper rescue. Thousands of Athenian sailors died within sight of their own fleet. When news reached Athens, grief curdled quickly into rage. The assembly voted to try all 6 presiding generals together, a single collective verdict for all of them. It was illegal, a clear violation of Athenian law that guaranteed each citizen an individual trial. The philosopher Socrates, serving that day as a presiding official, was reportedly the lone voice to object. The assembly condemned all 6 generals to death. Athens had just executed the men who won its last major naval victory. Into this self-inflicted wound stepped a Spartan admiral named Lysander. Methodical, patient, and utterly ruthless, Lysander had cultivated a relationship with the young Persian prince Cyrus that opened the treasury of the Persian Empire to Sparta's war effort. With seemingly unlimited funding, he rebuilt the Peloponnesian fleet and waited for his moment. It came in the summer of 405 BCE, at a stretch of beach on the Hellespont called Mesopotamia, the Goat Rivers. The Athenian fleet of around 180 triremes had been anchoring there each night, pulling ashore to forage for supplies in the surrounding countryside. For 4 consecutive days, Lysander watched and waited. Then, on the 5th day, the moment the Athenian crew scattered inland, he struck. The Athenian fleet was beached, nearly creeless, completely unprepared. In a matter of hours, Lysander captured or destroyed virtually the entire navy. 3,000 Athenian prisoners were executed on the shore. Only a handful of ships escaped. The war, for all practical purposes, was over. Lysander's fleet sailed to Athens and blockaded the harbor at Piraeus. A Spartan army encamped outside the long walls. Inside, the city slowly starved through the winter of 405 to 404 BCE. No grain ships could reach them. Allies sent nothing. The city that had once commanded hundreds of subject states now found itself utterly alone. In the spring of 404 BCE, Athens surrendered. The terms were deliberately humiliating. The long walls connecting Athens to Piraeus, the very fortifications that had made the city invulnerable for half a century, were to be demolished. The empire was dissolved. The fleet was reduced to a mere 12 ships. Sparta's allies had lobbied to raze the city entirely and enslave its population. Sparta declined, citing Athens as a fellow Greek city that had served well in the Persian Wars. The mercy was real, but thin. The walls came down to the sound of flute music, Lysander reportedly arranging musicians to mark the occasion. Spartan soldiers and Athenian collaborators swung their picks in time to the melody. Watching from the ruins of their ambitions, Athenians witnessed the end of their empire. But what came next would prove almost as destructive as the defeat itself. What followed Athens' defeat was not peace. It was vengeance dressed as governance. Sparta installed an oligarchic council of 30 men to rule the conquered city. History would remember them simply as the 30 tyrants. Led by the ruthless Critias, a former associate of Socrates himself, they launched a reign of terror that shocked even hardened observers. Within months, they had executed roughly 1,500 Athenian citizens and driven thousands more into exile. Property was seized. Political enemies were eliminated. Metics, the resident foreigners who had built their lives in Athens, were slaughtered for their wealth alone. But the exiles organized. In 403 BCE, a democratic resistance led by Thrasybulus swept back into Attica, defeated the tyrants in open fighting, and restored the democracy. Critias died in battle. The nightmare had lasted less than a year, but the wounds it left ran deep. Athens made a remarkable attempt at healing. The city passed an amnesty decree, one of history's earliest formal acts of political reconciliation, forbidding prosecution for crimes committed before the Restoration. Athenians were told, essentially, to forget, to move forward. The democracy would survive only if it could hold itself together. And yet some wounds refused to close. 4 years after the Restoration, in 399 BCE, a 70-year-old stonemason and philosopher named Socrates stood before a jury of 501 Athenian citizens on 2 charges: impiety toward the gods of the city and corrupting the minds of Athenian youth. His accusers were a poet named Meletus, a politician named Anytus, and an orator named Lycon. None of them were famous. Socrates was. The trial was, in ways no one could quite articulate cleanly, about everything the city had endured. Socrates had questioned authority, irritated the powerful, and counted among his companions men who had collaborated with tyranny, including Critias himself. He was not being tried for what he had done. He was being tried for what Athens had suffered and who it needed to blame. Socrates defended himself without apology. He refused to beg, refused to weep, refused the performance of remorse the court expected. He was found guilty by a margin of roughly 60 votes. When asked to propose his own punishment, he suggested the city might consider rewarding him instead. The jury condemned him to death by a larger margin than had found him guilty. He refused offers to escape. His friend Crito arranged everything. Socrates declined. To flee, he argued, would be to reject the very laws under which he had lived his entire life. He died in his prison cell, surrounded by friends, drinking the hemlock cup with a calm that left witnesses shattered. What Athens did to Socrates in 399 BCE would echo through every subsequent century of Western thought. A democracy executing its most probing mind and never quite recovering from the knowledge of what it had done. The hemlock had barely dried before Athens began, quietly and determinedly to rebuild. The city that emerged from the catastrophe of defeat was humbled, but not broken. Through the 380s BCE, Athenian leaders worked to restore what the Spartans had torn down, most visibly the long walls connecting the city to its harbor at Piraeus. Those walls were more than stone and mortar. They were a statement of intent. Athens would be a maritime power again. And in 378 BCE, that intent became institutional. Athens organized the Second Athenian League, a naval alliance framed deliberately to avoid the imperial abuses that had poisoned its predecessor. Member states would not pay tribute this time. Athens promised, in writing, that it would not garrison their cities or seize their land. It was, by ancient standards, a remarkably self-aware document, a great power acknowledging its own past sins. But even as Athens reassembled its alliances, the balance of Greek power was shifting in unexpected directions. The city of Thebes, long considered a secondary force, produced a military genius named Epaminondas who shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE. The Spartan army, the most feared in the Greek world for over a century, broke in the field. The age of Spartan dominance was finished, and Athens found itself navigating a suddenly unfamiliar landscape where no single city commanded absolute authority. Yet Athens' greatest 4th century achievement was not military. It was intellectual. Around 387 BCE, a philosopher named Plato, Socrates' most devoted student, founded a school in the grove of a hero named Nicodemus, just outside the city walls. The academy would endure for over 900 years. Within its gardens, Plato developed his theories of ideal forms, justice, and governance, ideas that would shape Christianity, Renaissance humanism, and modern political philosophy alike. Then, in 343 BCE, a young man from Macedonia named Aristotle, who had studied at the academy for nearly 20 years, would go on to found his own school, the Lyceum, completing an intellectual lineage running directly from Socrates through Plato to Aristotle, 3 thinkers who essentially invented Western philosophy between them. The courts, too, became a kind of theater. Orators like Demosthenes turned legal argument into high art, their speeches studied and imitated for millennia. But storms were gathering. The Social War of 357 to 355 BCE, a revolt by Athens' own allied states, exposed how thin the League's goodwill actually ran. The promises had not been enough. The alliance fractured, and Athens' second attempt at naval empire collapsed much as the first had. And far to the north in Macedonia, a shrewd and ruthless king named Philip II was watching all of this very carefully, building an army unlike anything Greece had ever seen. The man who saw it coming would not be believed until it was almost too late. Demosthenes was not a natural orator. As a young man, he had stuttered, struggled to project his voice, fumbled in front of crowds. The stories say he practiced speaking with pebbles in his mouth, declaiming against the roar of the sea on the Athenian shore. Whatever the method, by the 350s BCE he had transformed himself into the most dangerous political voice in Greece. And he had a singular, consuming message. Philip of Macedon was coming, and Athens was sleepwalking toward destruction. Beginning in 351 BCE, Demosthenes delivered a series of speeches so fierce and so precise that history would name the entire genre after their target. The Philippics warned, pleaded, and accused. They accused not just Philip but Athens itself, its citizens grown comfortable, its assembly more interested in festival funds than fighting funds, its generals conducting wars at arm's length with hired mercenaries rather than citizen soldiers. You seem to think, he thundered before the assembly, that you can vote away danger as easily as you vote away decrees. The crowds applauded and did little else. Meanwhile, Philip moved with the patience of a chess master. He seized Amphipolis and its gold mines, funding an army of ruthless professional soldiers. He used marriage alliances, bribery, and diplomacy as freely as he used cavalry. Sacred wars and regional rivalries gave him repeated invitations to intervene in Greek affairs, and each intervention left Macedonian influence slightly deeper, slightly more permanent. The Greek city-states, still squabbling with one another over ancient grievances, could not organize a coherent resistance. The reckoning came on a plain in Boeotia. On the 4th of August, 338 BCE, at Chaeronea, Philip's army met a combined Athenian and Theban force in the last great battle for Greek independence. The fighting was desperate. On the Macedonian left wing, Philip's 18-year-old son Alexander shattered the Theban sacred band, an elite unit of 150 pairs of soldiers who had never broken in battle. They died where they stood, every one of them. When the dust cleared, Athens and Thebes had been broken. Demosthenes himself fled the field. Philip was magnanimous in victory, at least toward Athens. He organized the League of Corinth the following year, a framework that bound every Greek state except Sparta under Macedonian leadership. The age of the independent polis was over. Athens retained its democracy, its walls, its fleet, but sovereignty now meant something different. Power lived in Macedon. Philip never saw his ultimate ambition realized. In 336 BCE, he was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, struck down by one of his own bodyguards. The throne passed to his son. Alexander was 20 years old, and he had been watching and learning for a very long time. What he would do with that inheritance would echo across centuries. Philip's son conquered the known world and carried Athenian culture with him like a torch. Alexander the Great had studied under Aristotle, and he packed Homer alongside his weapons. Greek language, Greek philosophy, Greek theater spread from Egypt to the borders of India. Athens itself, however, would never again command armies or shape the fate of nations. That work was finished at Chaeronea. one final defiance still smoldered. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, Athens seized the moment. Led by the orator Hyperides and the general Leosthenes, the city rallied a coalition of Greek states in what historians call the Lamian War, a last desperate bid to throw off Macedonian dominance. For a brief, electrifying season, it seemed possible. Then the Macedonian general Antipater crushed the rebellion at the Battle of Cranon in 322 BCE. Demosthenes, hunted and cornered, swallowed poison rather than face capture. The flame guttered out. What followed was not death but transformation. Athens became a jewel to be admired and plundered in equal measure. In 86 BCE, the Roman general Sulla besieged the city, punishing it for siding with the wrong king in the wrong war. His soldiers tore through the agora, looted temples, and cut down the ancient trees of the academy. The physical city bled. Yet even Sulla shipped Athenian libraries back to Rome, because the Romans understood something essential. Athens was worth more as a cultural trophy than as a ruin. And so Rome rebuilt what Rome had broken. The Emperor Hadrian, visiting in the 120 CE, fell genuinely in love with the city. He completed the enormous temple of Olympian Zeus, which had stood half-finished for nearly 7 centuries. He added a new district, the Hadrianopolis, essentially doubling the city's monumental footprint. He called himself a Philhellene, a lover of all things Greek, and he meant it. Athens, under Roman patronage, became a university town, a place where aristocratic Romans sent their sons to absorb philosophy and rhetoric. The streets Socrates had walked now educated the empire's future senators and emperors. The philosophical schools endured through all of it, the last living thread connecting the living city to its extraordinary past. Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, the Stoics, the Epicureans, all of them continued teaching through conquest and occupation and the slow grinding centuries of Roman rule. Then, in 529 CE, the Emperor Justinian issued a decree forbidding pagans from teaching philosophy. The schools closed. The last Neoplatonist scholars packed their manuscripts and departed for Persia. After nearly 1,000 years of continuous intellectual life, the lamp went dark. Or did it only travel? Those manuscripts reappeared, copied and translated in the libraries of the Islamic world. From there they reached medieval Europe, and then the Renaissance rediscovered Plato and Aristotle with the force of revelation. The Enlightenment built entire systems of democratic governance on Athenian foundations. The American founders read Thucydides and argued about Athens as they designed a republic. The word democracy itself is simply Greek for the people's power, carried intact across 2,500 years. How did one city, numbering perhaps 300,000 people at its peak, produce ideas powerful enough to organize entire civilizations it never knew existed? Perhaps the answer lies in the collision. Democracy forced open argument. Philosophy demanded justification. Tragedy insisted on honest reckoning with human failure. Athens was brilliant and reckless, generous and cruel, a city that exiled its greatest minds and then built monuments to them. In that very contradiction, it was completely human. And that, perhaps, is why it still speaks to us. Athens didn't just shape the ancient world. It shaped the one we live in today, and its echoes of democracy, reason, and restless inquiry still ring through every courtroom, classroom, and capital on Earth. Subscribe for more histories that explain how we got here.